Afternoon. I'm sure you're all sitting out there wondering what's this crazy Mongani doing up here. Talking to you about Jicarilla history. Well, I grew up here. I grew up here. My classmates were the Foyas and Montoyas and the Jesuses and D Hills and Velardes and Winoskis. And you go out there and look at 1968, that was my class. So, I had somebody ask me, had I consulted the tribal elders before putting this together? And there's two answers to that. One, the people you would think of as tribal elders were my classmates. And the other part is, yes, there were people alive who had negotiated some of the treaties back in the 19th century. They were still here. And I heard some of the history from them. And being a kid, I didn't listen as well as I should have. And then, as an adult, being a guy who can write a good story and who can do some good research, I wanted to tell this story. So, a year ago, the Santa Fe Trail Association invited me to speak to their national convention. I was keynote speaker, and if you want to hear a horror story, I'll tell you about the conditions that was under. But for 3 days, we heard nothing about how Indians were victims. Indians were victims. They couldn't take care of themselves. We had to care for them. And I finally got up at the end. I was keynote speaker. And I said, the Jicarilla Apache were people who stood up for themselves on that road to conquest. They fought back. Now, I come from a people, you wouldn't, most of you I don't think would know their name. So I won't burden you with it. One of our songs says, our tongue is no longer spoken. Sound familiar? And our towns all around face ruin. I dream of a bridge on the Tamar that opens us up to the east. And the English, they live in our houses. And the Spanish, they fish in our seas. We drove the Spanish from those seas. But now the English say that we can't fish. But the Spanish don't care. They come and fish. And the English, they think that our country is a beautiful place to go on summer vacation. The heroes of the English. Think about this. There's a message here. Queen Boudica, 2,000 years ago. She fought the Romans. And eventually she was defeated and tortured to death. King Arthur was a Romano-Briton. He was mostly Roman. And he fought the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons. And eventually he was overrun. Alfred the Great, the only English king called great, he was an Anglo-Saxon. And he fought the Norman, the Viking invasion. And of course, we're still stuck with a king and queen that are descended from the Normans. Robin Hood, he fought the Normans. I like him. Robin Hood's a cool guy. He stole from the government to give to the poor. And Sir Francis Drake, he was one of my people. He fought the Spanish, but the English think he's their hero. I want you to think of the 300 Spartans. Have you heard that story? The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae faced off 20,000 Persians, fought them for 3 days, fought the elite of their army, and tore the heart out of that army. They all got killed, but they gave the other Greeks time to come around and drive the Persians out of Greece. Today you don't hear nothing about Persians, but the Greeks are still there. They died heroes. Now, in thinking about our past and all those things I heard at the Santa Fe Trail Association, I had to think about heroes on both sides. I had to think about the Anglo-Saxons, the English coming to North America They came from a land that was fenced and surveyed. And if the land wasn't fenced and surveyed, it was open land for anyone. It was pasture or commons for cutting firewood. The mountains, the forest, the frontier, that was a land of outlaws and raiders. They feared those people. They feared mounted raiders. The Mongols overran Europe at one point. And the Scots reavers, how many of you know what a reaver is? Reaver's a cow thief. My mother's family come from up on the Scots border. She had family on both sides. For 400 years, the English raided the Scots, and the Scots raided the English, stealing their cattle. But they were afraid of those people. They thought the only people that could make a civilized country were yeoman farmers. And folks who faced the frontier, who faced new lands, deserts, things they weren't familiar with, rivers they didn't know how to cross, and faced the wild people on the frontier, faced the danger, they were heroes. On the other side were the Jicarilla Apache. They were in the mountains and plains. Oh, they were the kind of people we were afraid of. They farmed a little. How many of you have heard of the Neolithic Revolution? I hate that term, because anybody who lives close to nature knows how to make plants grow. And the Jicarilla knew how to farm. They always did. Nobody had to teach them. If you read the history, if you look back, but they were out there defending their hunting lands. And when you think about it, the Navajo and the Comanche and the Kiowa were disputing who owned those hunting lands. So they were constantly at war. The land was unsurveyed or contested by others. They were feared, your ancestors were feared and needed by the Spanish, who were deathly afraid of them. They were heroes who were defending their land and their family. Now, the Spanish and Mexicans had a medieval landholding system. They had an overlord, and they had commons. They were irrigation farmers. Irrigation farmers discourages personal industry. If your crops grow better than the next guy's, everybody thinks you're a witch and you must be stealing water. They had a medieval economy with no manufacturing. They were metal poor. They drove carretas that screamed as they moved because it was wood on wood. They had no metal for bearings. They lacked tools. They were farming with bent sticks that they fire hardened because they didn't have metal to make plows. They were so metal poor they didn't have pots and pans. They depended on the Jicarilla to make micaceous pottery for them because they could put that directly on the fire. But they were also scared of the Jicarilla because as soon as they left their villages, they were in Jicarilla country. The Spanish and Mexicans never got further than Taos. Their whole New Mexico was from Taos down to Socorro. Abiquiu to Las Vegas, hardly 10 miles either side of the Rio Grande. And what held them back? Oh, Navajos, Jicarilla, Utes, Comanche. Our founding fathers, people like Jefferson, thought that only yeoman farmers could make good citizens in a democratic republic. It's kind of unfortunate because they spent a century trying to turn all Native Americans into farmers. But frankly, most Native Americans knew better. Subsistence agriculture is a good way to die or be very poor. The first time you have a bad year, no rain, you starve to death. There's another thing that caused problems with people. Something I learned as a child is possession in a way that we wouldn't recognize. I got shown in the hillside of choke cherries. I'm going to go get some. No, that belongs to Mrs. V. Hill. You know, I would have taken it as wild and open for anyone to take. But the Jicarilla and the Hockings belong to. In the past, I went through all those invaders who came to England. The invaders didn't used to care. They'd overrun, they'd conquer, and completely submerge a people. And that's the way it had been through history, everywhere. We've all been conquered. The people who came to America had the idea that they were Christians and they ought to do something better. And so they tried to turn people into farmers. Unfortunately, there was an awful racist side to this. And I hope you don't mind the term, but they thought about their little red brothers who had to be taken care of because they were like children and didn't know how to do things and didn't know how to hang on to land. And really, it's a racist thing, and believe me, it's still with us. The people in Washington, D.C. still think that they know how to spend our money better than we do. They think they know how we should live our lives. And we still see that today. So, in figuring out what was Jicarilla land, I looked at where they were encountered, where they seemed to roam comfortably, know the hunting grounds, where they fought battles. And it was bigger than what anyone else had said. It extended west of the Rio Grande to where we are now. The people in Tierra Amarilla weren't there because the Jicarilla were. It extended through the Rio Grande country. Everywhere there wasn't a Spanish village, a Mexican village, was Jicarilla country. And then east of the Sangre de Cristo, all the way out to where Texas is now, north to the Arkansas and south to the Canadian. That was Jicarilla country. All of northeastern New Mexico. My wife likes to say this guy looks like a crazy man. I think she's right. This is James Kirker. He was one of the first Americans to interact with the Jicarilla. Kirker was a former mountaineer, and he had a little army of about 50 men, mostly former mountain men, about half of them Delaware Indians. How many of you have heard of Canarsie? It's a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York City. That was one of the tribal names of the Delaware. They traded with the Dutch and English for beaver pelts and got moved west and west and west and across the Mississippi. And when the mountain men came out, they taught the mountain men to hunt beaver. About half his army were Delaware Indians. He got a contract from the governor of Chihuahua to hunt Apache scalps. After a while, he found it was simpler to take Mexican scalps. They were easier to get, and the governor didn't seem to know the difference. But the first thing this guy did with his army was come north to Ranchos de Taos, where the Jicarilla stole half his horses. Unfortunately, they didn't get them all, so the Jicarilla were chased down, and Kirker chased them back to Ranchos de Taos. And that's an unfortunate first incident. The next interaction was at Abiquiu with General Kearny, who conquered New Mexico without a fight. In September 1846, he met with the Jicarilla leaders. We don't have a written treaty to refer to. One of his men wrote down what happened. Kearny said, look, if you don't kill us and you don't raid us, we won't kill you and we'll trade with you. And both sides said, that sounds like a good idea. The war with Mexico went on, and some of the Plains tribes, including the Jicarilla, decided that they would get even for past slights because the army was busy fighting Mexicans. One of the first people to know this was Lucian Maxwell. Lucian Maxwell had married into a French-Mexican family in Taos and was busy with his family putting together the largest land holding in North America, the Maxwell Land Grant. It included all of northeast New Mexico. In other words, Jicarilla country. But that hadn't happened yet. At this point, he's working for his father-in-law, and he had gone up to Pueblo in Colorado to trade with the Ute and the Jicarilla for deerskins. As he came back to Raton Pass, he found a huge Jicarilla village. Bigger than he would have expected for people hunting. Bigger than the way that people usually lived in 40 people villages. And he said, uh-oh, it's a war party. So he turned around and went back, and a bunch of people from Pueblo decided they were going to leave, and they went with him, and they went back again, and they got chased back to Pueblo. Being a stubborn guy, Lucian now made his third attempt. He went to Bent's Ford, and he got 15 men. And they decided they were going to sneak past the Jicarilla by going through Monte Burro Pass, about 6 miles to the east of Raton. They were going to get through without being detected. And what do you think happened? Yeah, the Jicarilla saw them, and a fight ensued, and about 3 of them got killed, and a couple of the Jicarilla, and Lucian was wounded and unconscious, and his servant carried him up the mesa. The Jicarilla had closed the trail for the first time. Now, meanwhile, Kit Carson and Lieutenant Brewerton were coming from California carrying dispatches for Washington, D.C., and they'd made a real hard crossing on the old Spanish Trail. Across the deserts without water and mostly without food, they got to the Colorado River, what they called the Grand River, and made 2 rafts. They lost 1 raft, along with half of their rifles, most of their food, most of their ammunition, and 4 men's pants. On the other side of the river, they were 200 miles from the next town. 200 miles from help. 200 miles from town. They made the journey unable to hunt without any of their food supplies. If you've seen pictures of Kit Carson before, look at him in this picture. He's about 40 pounds lighter than he was before. As they got closer to Taos, they crossed the trail. The kid said, uh-oh, it's a war party. How do you know? No trap-wall, so there won't be any women and children. If it's Utes, I think we'll be okay. But if it's a Jicarilla, we're in real trouble. Well, it was Jicarilla. And they detected him. He tried to hug the mountain bottom, the foot of the mountain. But he was detected. He ran his horses back into the trees where they'd be hard to get at, and he lined his men up. These walking skeletons who hadn't eaten in days, lined up. Half of them without rifles, nobody with any ammunition, and 4 men standing there without pants. And he decided he was going to intimidate the Jicarilla. It didn't work very well. But suddenly a Jicarilla rider rode up, and the Jicarilla took off. He brought a message. There were Missouri mounted volunteers coming from over the mountain. And they chased the Jicarilla up into the Cumbres Pass. And there they fought a battle. Now the Missouri mounted volunteers were in the open. And the Jicarilla were up on the hill and in the woodline. The Missourians claimed a great victory, although they lost a half a dozen men. They claimed the Jicarilla had lost many. I kind of doubt it. But we went for a year without a major incident. And then the Jicarilla showed up at Las Vegas. They wanted to trade. Unfortunately, they wanted to trade for whiskey and ammunition. Lieutenant Ambrose Burnside was sent out to decide whether they were friendly or here to make trouble. Burnside, you might remember him as a Union general. They claimed sideburns are named for him. Anyway, at this point, he's a lieutenant. And he goes out and he decides the Jicarilla want trouble. He attacks and kills 14 Jicarilla and captures 6, including Lobo Blanco's daughter. That says to me that the Jicarilla weren't looking for trouble. If he was able to attack and kill that many people, they weren't ready for a fight. So there were repercussions. The last wagon train of the season was coming over the trail from Independence in October, led by FX Aubrey, the skimmer of the plains, all 5'4" of him. Little guy. This is the guy who rode from Santa Fe to Independence, 900 miles, in 5.5 days. He's leading the wagon train. Along with him is James White, who is bringing his wife Ann and his baby daughter Virginia out to Santa Fe. Now they've got a couple of light Dearborn wagons drawn by horses. Everything else is being drawn by slow-moving oxen. And White says, I'm going to move ahead real fast and get into Santa Fe and get my wife and baby to comfort. FX told him not a good idea. But he did it anyway. 9 men went with him. He took off, got about a day ahead of the wagon train when he ran into Jicarilla. Now, the tribal elders told me, we were just there to collect the toll. Make us gifts, cross our country in peace. One of the white men panicked, shot a Jicarilla, and within minutes, all of the white men were dead, and Ann White was a captive. Santa Fe and the army were very slow to respond. Burnside asked if he could go out and try and trade Lobo Blanco's daughter for Ann White. Santa Fe told him no, which probably explains why she ended up with a mail party led by a sergeant out at Wagon Mound. And they went up to the top of Wagon Mound to look for the smoke of the Jicarilla camp. And she began singing her death song, and that's what they said, and freaked everybody out, so they went back down. And the next morning, she grabbed a bowie knife off one of the soldiers and killed a mule and cut another one so badly they couldn't use it. And then she went after a soldier. And they shot her. It took a full month before Santa Fe and the army were ready to move. They sent 2 companies of dragoons, cavalrymen, and a company of spies and guides under Antoine LaRue over the mountains to Rayada, where they talked to Kit. And they said, Kit, I need you as my chief scout. Kit says, you've got Antoine LaRue. He's as good as I am. Antoine agreed heartily. The major said, your country needs you. Kit says, hey, wait, I'm at peace with Jicarilla. They come by, I give them a meal, I give them a few head of cattle, they're happy, I'm happy, I know I'm on their land. Finally, the major says, the woman's counting on you. This kid couldn't resist. And it turned out he was the only one who could follow the trail. Through the breaks of the canyon, 900 feet deep of the Canadian River, followed it for 200 miles, a month-old trail. It had snowed in between, but he was the only one that could follow it. And when they got down near the Canadian River, down near Chumacacori Butte, Kit says, I smell the fires of their camp. I'm going to go ahead and I'll signal you to attack, and we'll get in there as quick as we can, capture the woman without getting anybody hurt. He rode out ahead. The Jicarilla saw him. He signaled the attack. The Jicarilla started firing. A spent bullet hit the major in his heavy gloves, knocking him off his horse, and he decided now he wanted to negotiate. 3 times they sent out a white flag. 3 times it was rejected. Finally, they attacked. The Jicarilla had time to withdraw across the river. The army took the Jicarilla camp. They burned their winter supplies. heavy robes, their teepees. The Jicarilla only had their horses. They found the dead body of Ann White. The next day, there was a terrible blizzard. The army, on its way back to Las Vegas, got so lost they ended up closer to Fort Union. One of the men froze to death in his saddle. I can only imagine the hardship in the Jicarilla camp without winter robes, without food. That winter kit got raided. And by the way, that definitely closed the trail the second time. And in the spring, the Jicarilla closed it again for the third time. They wiped out an 11-man mail party at Wagon Mountain. Everyone thought 11 men on the plains, fully armed, ought to be safe. They weren't. So the wagon trains wouldn't move. The mail parties wouldn't move. The army turned out and chased the Jicarilla through the spring, through the summer, and finally in March of '53, Governor William Carr Lane came in and he made a treaty with the Jicarilla and with the Cherokee, asking them to take up farming. They would be supplied with food until they could farm for themselves and with tools and training. And the Jicarilla did on the Rio Puerco near Abiquiu, where that big lake is now. And eventually, Congress did not ratify the treaties, though I think both the Jicarilla and the Cherokee pretty much abided by them up until the start of the Civil War. The money dried up. The governor left. He was replaced by a governor from the other political party. And the new governor was a consummate bureaucrat and politician. He knew that if he tried to get his predecessor's treaty ratified, it would be the treaty of the other party, it would be the treaty of the other governor. If he asked Washington for money, he'd be unpopular. So he did what any good bureaucrat would do. He screamed, "It's all my predecessor's fault. As soon as I stop feeding these people, there will be a war." And he preached that for almost 6 months, and there was no war. The Jicarilla wanted peace. In January 1854, Kit Carson became the Jicarilla youth agent. In March of '54, there was a very minor incident. At the ranch of Watrous, the beef supplier for the army. Watrous was a hard-headed German, one of those guys who won't put up with anything. Some Jicarilla stole 3 of his horses, and they say he insulted Watrous's herders. I think that means the Jicarilla beat them up. And now the Mexicans were terrified to work for Watrous. Watrous says, "I won't supply beef to the government anymore." He screamed and shouted, "Do something, do something." And Lieutenant Bell was sent out with 30 men, with the worst orders I've ever seen. Go and find the camp, surround it, make them give up the guys that stole the horses, get the horses back, and whip the guys. If they won't give you those guys, take 4 of their leaders and twice as many horses. And we're talking about people who were starving. Those horses were food. But take twice as many horses. And of course, this would start a fight, and it did. And about evenly matched numbers of Jicarilla and mounted troops. The Jicarilla were on foot. The troops were mounted. They got into a fight. About 3 were killed on each side. Lobo Blanco was killed. And he took many bullets, and he was a hard man to kill. Bell was now a hero. The Jicarilla headed for Picaries, where they often went to make micaceous pottery. They stopped at Mora, and the people of Mora were terrified. The army sent Lieutenant Davidson over the mountain from Taos to talk to the Jicarilla. He counted 107 warriors. He continued on down to Fort Union and stayed with Lieutenant Bell and Colonel Cook and managed to insult both of them by telling them, oh, those Jicarilla ain't nothing. Give me 60 men and I'll ride all through the Jicarilla and it won't be any trouble at all. This idiot had just come from California where he had conducted the Bloody Island Massacre and had massacred men, women, and children, 70 in number, on one of the California tribes. Not my favorite person. In any event, Kit met the Jicarilla at Picaris, and he could see that they were starving. And he says, I'm going to go to Santa Fe, and I'll make the governor provide rations. Stay here. Well, the army watched. The Jicarilla, they thought, had disappeared. They only continued on to the usual campsite. But the army was now panicked. Where did they go? And they sent out Lieutenant Davidson with 2 companies of dragoons, 60 men. And he went down the Rio Grande and saw the fires of the Jicarilla camp. They were on a narrow spur high up in the mountain. It's not a big enough campsite for very many people. Very steep sides down to the canyon. And they're not trying to hide, that's why he saw their fires. So he comes up the canyon, and when he gets close to the village, he attacks. And he's attacking up a slope like this. So now would attack, and pretty soon they had to dismount. And then they were dragging their horses. And pretty soon they had to leave the horses behind. And when you leave the horses behind in the army, you leave the number 4s, the horse holders, a quarter of his command, behind to hold the horses. And then he continued in 2 columns up to the Jicarilla camp, and he found that Fletcher Rayado had evacuated the camp, but then everybody was gone, except for maybe one elderly couple. Somebody shot one of the sergeants. The soldiers shot the elderly couple, and from down below, they heard a voice, they're stealing the horses! So Davidson attacked back down the hillside. And that's when the Jicarilla attacked. They hit him from one side, and then they'd hit him from the other side. And when he got down where the horses were, they were using high-angle arrow fire. Couldn't see who was firing it, dropping arrows in among them. Not killing a lot of people, but wounding a lot of people and horses. And they would attack from one side, and when Davidson moved his men to defend on that side, the Jicarilla backed off and attacked from the other side. And after a while of that, Davidson totally panicked, and he screamed, flee and save yourselves. Not retreat, flee. And they did. Imagine one man in the saddle holding a wounded man in front of him, with another wounded man hanging onto his stirrup. And they're trying to go up the far side of the canyon. The doctor got so far ahead that Davidson had to beg him to come back. On either side, they saw the Jicarilla going up the sides. When they got to the saddle, one soldier described the arrows coming thick as snow in a blizzard. The soldiers fought their way back to the Rio Grande. And when they got there, out of 60 dragoons, 22 were dead, 36 were wounded. The man they sent for help had an arrow through his thigh. The lieutenant had an arrow in his back. They were down to their last 4 rounds of ammunition, and the Jicarilla broke contact. Jicarilla losses? Just 2. And 1 woman wounded. And since they evacuated the women and children, I suspect she was out front collecting arrows for reuse. Does that sound like anybody you know? Would your aunt do that? No? Is that a hell of a victory? Think of it. 22 dead, 36 wounded, and Jicarilla had 2 dead. They could have finished these guys off. Governor Messervy, acting governor, Meriwether, was back in Washington looking for another job. Declared war on the Jicarilla. I didn't know governors had that authority. But he literally declared war. Meanwhile, Davidson was in disgrace. They stripped his unit of all their good horses so that they ended up walking their horses because they couldn't ride them. They had one pot and pan between 30 men. All their gear was in terrible shape. They were sent down to, yeah, which fort?
I can't remember.
You don't remember that. It'll come to me in a second. But they were sent down near El Paso, Fort Fillmore. The other company that was involved later mutinied. And people have been caught on, why did that company mutiny? Well, they just lost half their strength in a terrible, terrible battle. And it ended with their major fist fighting one of the men in the plaza at Taos. You can imagine that. Anyway, so Davidson was in disgrace. He was eventually put before a board of inquiry. Meanwhile, Kit Carson became the chief scout and guide. They put together 4 companies of men, left from Taos, and pursued the Jicarilla to the Battle of Ojo Caliente on the Vallecitos River. It's March. The snow is still 4 feet deep in the shadows. The soldiers came down the mountain. The Jicarilla defended from a place where the cliff had broken down. Brilliant rear guard action. I mean, rear guard actions are a good way to get killed if you're a soldier. We like to refer to it as the dip mission, die in place, because once you've held off the enemy long enough, it's hard to get away. But the Jicarilla did it brilliantly. While the dragoons, the cavalry, went around the flanks, the infantry attacked up the center. The Jicarilla withdrew across the river. They only lost 5 or 6 people. But they lost their camp, what little food they had. And now, without shelter, without heavy roads, they retreated through the hills, pursued by the army, going toward Abaque. And in the next 2 weeks, 15 women and children died in Spain. At Abaque, Kit had a letter written for him. The Apaches about Taos were driven to war by the actions of the officers and troops. He called for a just treaty to be made with them. In other words, that treaty Carl Lee had made. Governor Messervy responded, "We can't have peace, I just declared war." What? The war went on through the summer and into the fall. And in October, there was a meeting with the Ute and the Jicarilla at Abaque, and Governor Meriwether was back. He came in with the usual gifts. A gift of sheep to be food to the conference. He turned it over to Kit. Kit turned it over to the leaders of the Ute and Jicarilla. The governor went berserk. Oh, if you give them all of them, you're supposed to give them just a few at a time. If you give them all of them, they'll kill them all and they'll take off. They act like little children. And Kit didn't believe that. He knew better. He knew the Jicarilla as men, as equals. The governor also brought used coats and used blankets. One of the Utes was so angry that he tore his in half. Somebody was approaching, and the Ute decided that it must be the governor that sold him out to the Navajo, and everybody took off. The conference broke up. The Ute leaders caught smallpox on their way home. And they blamed it on the governor. So the Ute were now at war. In December, the Ute and Jicarilla wiped out Pueblo. You all know Pueblo, Colorado? It was 9 years before they rebuilt, which is why Pueblo is not the oldest town in Colorado. The war went on through the winter into the spring. One little battle after another. In one battle, one of the doctors had a brand new Colt pistol, and a Ute was attacking him, and he fired all 6 shots and missed each time. Finally threw the pistol at the guy and was shot. In any event, there was a lot of suffering because they couldn't hunt. As the spring came on, we're retreating through places that are flooded, icy water, and right through the summer, pursuit goes on until finally Governor Merriweather wants to make a treaty. Kit remains as Indian agent up until 1861 when he became a colonel in the Union Army. The Jicarilla, this was a good time for them in some ways. They were living in Abiquiu and Cimarron. They were farming. They report some of the folks report being happy. But the Mexicans didn't want them anywhere near. They were afraid. In 64, November, Kit Carson took an army of 500 against the Kiowa and Comanche. He took with him 100 Jicarilla and Ute scouts. They overran the Kiowa camp. This is the first battle of the Adobe Walls. And then they saw the Comanche camp. And there were more Comanche in that winter camp than they ever imagined existed. And Kit turned to his Jicarilla scouts and he said, "What should we do?" And they said, "Get the hell out of here." Kit's officers said, "No, we ought to stay and fight." They were annoyed because he asked his scouts rather than his officers. They withdrew, and Kit saved his army, and the Jicarilla helped him do that. In 68, they went with the Ute to see President Grant. Grant promised them the reservation that's marked 1880 on the map. That's the beginning of this reservation. Now understand that the Tierra Honoria land grant had been vacant until at least 1867, when the Army put in Fort Lowell. And then the Mexicans started moving in. And what happens now when the Jicarilla say, "Yeah, we'll take that as our reservation"? The Mexicans go, "No, that's too close. That's too close." So they changed it, and they picked a spot there that's marked 1874. And that's too close, that's too close. They never suggested Hawaii, but I think that might have been far enough. Finally, in 1880, it was promised to them again. And after that, the Jicarilla were sent to Mescalero, where the Mescalero had been there for 10 years, had all the best land, had all the places close to schools, and 400 Mescaleros, 800 Jicarilla, and the Jicarilla had to send their children to boarding school, and all the tribal cops were Mescaleros. And Jicarilla got sick of that. Plus, Billy the Kid stole some of their horses. Any of you know about that? The first Jicarilla that went down, Billy the Kid stole their horses. Anyway, the Jicarilla finally said, "What should we do?" They went to the governor and said, "Hey, if we give up being a tribe, can we be homesteaders?" The governor said, "Yeah, I think that's how it works." So in a daring midnight raid, the Jicarilla stole their children from the boarding school and took off, headed north. They were pursued by the same army that had pursued Geronimo, except now the leaders of that army are writing letters to Washington. "Why are we pursuing these people? They aren't causing any trouble." Meanwhile, the Mexicans were in absolute terror. Finally, the government relented. and said, well, we'll give them the reservation they were promised. The one right here. You guys settled that for yourselves. Against all odds and refusals, you picked the spot where you settled. Any questions? Not a one? I got two heads shaking down here. No, don't be afraid. Yes, ma'am. Was I here? I was here from 1961 to 1970. Yes, sir.
This is from now we're doing now the building on the building. Then in front of one to see over from. You have to build a building and build a cities on cities on two cities on two cities from new on building our cities are just
I could barely hear. Did you hear? All ears. Yes, sir. I can barely hear. I'm sorry. I guess it's my ears. Yeah. Mr. Alote? Well, I'm going to be able to brag that I taught Jicarilla history to Jicarilla, and I still got my hair. So thank you, and thank you for listening. I hope you got something.